George Groves versus Chris Eubank Jr. In this video, I'm going to be discussing the outcome of this fight and what the future holds for both fighters. But I'd love you to do the same. So jump down to the comment section below and let me know how you saw the fight, whether you thought the result was correct, and what you see the future for both fighters. And remember to subscribe to this channel, Boxing Predictions, for big fight predictions coming in the future. So last night we saw George Groves retain his WBA super version of the super middleweight championship and take on Chris Eubank's title as well by unanimous decision. Now this was the first semi-final of the World Boxing Super Series. We've got the second one coming next week between Smith and Bramer. If you want to watch the prediction on that, jump to the channel and check that out. So the scorecards for this fight were 117-112, 116-112, and 115-113, all in favour of George Groves. Personally, I had it 115-113 to George Groves, and I wouldn't be able to justify a result in favour of Chris Eubank Jr. I've read a few reports this morning that actually did favour the Brighton man, but for me, I can't see any outcome where Chris Eubank Jr. wins more than 6 rounds. Okay. Now, the overriding view from most people is that George Groves put on a bit of a masterclass, and that Chris Eubank Jr. was also exposed as nothing more than a brawler. Now, are these statements the truth, or can we actually explain them? So let's just have a little think about what we saw. Now, a lot of people are saying that George Groves boxed really well and he jabbed his way to victory. But the stats don't really back that up, because George Groves failed to land more than 3 jabs in at least 7 of the rounds. So was his jab as effective as the consensus will tell us? Did Chris Eubank underperform, or was he limited by what he could do by an early cut? Okay, but for me, the story of this fight was definitely what George Groves did well. And what he did well was one thing, and this is how I think he won the fight, okay? What he did well was that he nullified Chris Eubank Jr. on the inside. Every time Jr. got in close, George Groves tied him up. He had slight feints and movements that meant that, you know, he was able to avoid the Eubank attack. Now, how often did we see Chris Eubank land one of his trademark uppercuts? Hardly ever. We're talking about maybe once or twice in 12 rounds. And this is his bread and butter. This is where he hurts opponents with vicious uppercuts over and over again. We've seen it in so many of his fights where this is where he's genuinely hurt his opponents. This is where he's tired out his opponents to do different offenses in different parts of rounds. But it's those getting in close, getting in tight, and, you know, getting those uppercuts. He just wasn't able to land them, and it's because of what George Groves was doing. And I say this was the key to why George Groves won the fight, in my opinion. You know, some people will say maybe this was because of the size advantage that George Groves had. We're talking about possibly 14 pounds on the night, people are, you know, guessing. But for me, I think that would discredit what George Groves did. The work that he did in preventing what Chris Eubank Jr. could do, which I thought was impressive in this department. So, you know, the fight itself had a bit of a tentative start in the early rounds. George Groves, he took those early rounds, but neither fighter really excelled. Some people will say that Eubank started slow, okay? That he should have started quicker, okay? But, you know, had he rushed in early rounds, we might be talking about an early knockout victory for George Groves. It's an easy night, okay? Also, we know that Chris Eubank, he got cut early. You know, there was a lot of head clashes throughout the fight. I mean, I saw that Chris Eubank was blaming George Groves for headbutting him, but, you know, it can be pretty difficult when you're going with a style where you're trying to rush in, or you have to rush in. You know, head clashes are going to happen. Unfortunate for Chris Eubank, he got that cut, and you know, it was his first cut of his career. You know, Chris Eubank Jr. supporters will highlight that as a crucial aspect to why the fight went the way it did. Okay, Chris Eubank Jr. said in the post-fight interview that he actually couldn't see out of that eye from from when it happened for the rest of the fight, and that's the majority of the fight. So if we are to believe that that is true, okay, you know, can we also have the opinion that George Groves' performance was so excellent? I mean, it's one of those difficult situations to try and digest, you know. But as the fight progressed, Chris Eubank Jr. did get joy, so maybe it wasn't as hindering as he led on, okay. But he did go head hunting in a big way, which might suggest that it was hindering him, and he had to just go for it. He had to jump in with those big lefts, try and get in close and swing for the fences, you know. And these punches were accentuated because he was missing so wildly, you know, in the later rounds, okay. But either way, for me, Chris Eubank Jr. didn't do enough to win, and I couldn't possibly justify a scenario where he did win that fight. You know, and I like to play devil's advocate a lot when scoring and analysing fights. I like to see rounds I like to assess rounds that were, you know, fairly close, and see whether, you know, could you justify? Was there one moment in that deserved the round to go in one fighter's favour? You know, but for me, as I said, I scored this 7-5, and that's about the best scenario that I could give to Eubank, and that is the victory for George Groves, okay. But I'm sure people will tell me otherwise. They'll tell me that the stats are, that the punch stats were quite even. You know, there was a lot of rounds where there was 1 or 2 punches landed. You know, that doesn't really tell the story of a fight, and we know that, and we can appreciate it. And some people will tell me that the more eye-catching punches were from Chris Eubank Jr. You know, the hurtful punches. You know, it never looked like Chris Eubank Jr. was going to be stopped, but you know, there was some, you know, hairy moments for George Groves towards the end, possibly while he had his own injury. Okay, but either way, this is the way the fight's gone. But something I wanted to mention, something I found really interesting, was that on the the show we had Prince Naz as a pundit. We had Prince Naz as a pundit on the night. You know, he did a complete 180 from telling everyone that Chris Eubank Jr. was going to win the fight easily, he was going to outbox George Groves, he was going to win on points easily, to come the end of the fight saying he was done. He was done, should retire, he can't box. You know, some would say that these are the words of a quitter himself. But in my opinion, I just think these were ridiculous comments, and you could see that his co-pundits that were with him were a bit uneasy about what he was saying. He seemed a bit on edge, so to speak, if you know what I'm saying. Just crazy. I don't think this is at a time when Chris Eubank Jr. should be considering retiring. He's still fairly young, you know, he's got a lot in the tank, and you know, he's an exciting fighter. You know, even if we just mention the obvious, okay, that, you know, George Groves himself fell short numerous times in his chance to win world titles against better opponents, you know, and he has managed to come back and he's took on a title. You know, the man that Chris Eubank Jr. actually called out, Caleb Truax, who beat James DeGale, you know, just a month or so ago, he himself, he lost his big fights of his career before he got that, you know, that opportunity. He upset the odds. No one thought that Truax was going to beat James DeGale. It was just ridiculous to consider it, but he managed to do it. So, come on, you know, do I believe that Chris Eubank can be in big fights again? Of course. Do I think he's good for boxing? Definitely. Can he win a world title? Maybe. We'll have to wait and see. You know, I enjoyed the fight. I thought it was a great watch. We had sort of different styles. They both got injured to certain extents. I would definitely watch a rematch. I think it would be great to see it. But do I think that George Groves has enough fights left in him for us to see that? not convinced. I mean, I never thought that George Groves had many more fights. I thought that it seemed to be telling the story that he was going into this World Boxing Super Series, win it, get the Ali Trophy, and then, you know, maybe call it a day. But we'll have to see whether George Groves can make this final, you know, whether they actually postpone the final if the injury is too serious, or whether they bring in a replacement. Okay, Chris Eubank Jr. was eager to jump in that in-ring interview that he would be like, oh, I must be the next one in line if George Groves can't go in. But, you know, I think George Groves should be given the opportunity to fight in it. I mean, to bring in a replacement in a final would be really lame. Really, really lame. We saw those replacements in the you know, the tournament that we saw some years ago with Froch and Ward and all those guys, and there was lots of replacements coming here and there, and it just made a mockery of it. We don't want to see replacements. We want to see the people that win progress, and then see what the true final is. Okay. So we'll just have to wait and see what happens with the injury. Hopefully he'll be fit, and in all probability George Groves will go on to win the tournament. Okay, but we'll have to wait and see. As I say, there's the second semi-final, Smith versus Bramer. Check out the channel to see the preview on it. Remember to leave me as many comments as you like. You know, pick this apart. I'd love to hear comments from everyone. You know, and we'll see you in the next prediction soon.